this, it outperforms Clearfill. Does really well. And they accomplished their goal. Gordon Christensen, the god of dentistry, got a hold of it and said, wow, this stuff is super strong on both enamel and dentin. And they've had a huge chip away at Clearfill's market share in the U.S. because it's doing so well. Well, the thing that's unique about Clearfill and XTR is acid concentration. And that's a common thing. When self-etchers work well, it seems to be that the acid formulation in that self-etching component is an effective modifier of dentin. And that seems to be what causes these products to work well. One thing Kerr did in manufacturing XTR was to get the film thickness down so low that it had both direct and indirect applications. So when you look at the literature that's out there on self-etchers compared to total etchers, most of the literature will recognize that for a self-etcher to work, it's really dependent on the acid concentration within the first component. And that's how it works. And oftentimes the total etch will beat it. So that's important to recognize with these. Now, every year at the university, since we have a very large research area, we run all 150 students through exercises in bond strengths. So each student has to do 7 shear bond strength exercises on different bonding agents. We provide them with the bonding agents and the instructions. And we use the students to test these products. So this is the data that we tested this last year. We had 150 samples of each of these bonding agents. And you can see that we took OptiBond Solo Plus, which we use at the dental school, a 5th generation bonding agent. We put it up against OptiBond XTR, Kerr's 6th generation, against a Clearfill, against Pete from Ultradent, against a Boku product, which was a 7th generation bonding agent, and against a Dent Supply product and a 3M product. And ran 150 samples with students following the instructions. And what we found actually was that XTR, a 6th generation bonding agent, got the highest results in student hands. They were less likely to foul it up. The data we collected also showed that a 7th generation, like all the other literature says, didn't do as well as any 5th or 6th on average. And that's pretty telling. But the interesting thing, not in this average bond strength, because these are all reasonable except for Futura bond. 17 is miserably low on dent. That runs the risk of failing with light curing, because light curing generates between 17 and 18 megapascals of energy when it happens. So right there we could break our bond. But that's not the only thing that's telling about this data. The other thing that's telling is the range. And what this reports to on this graph is the range you see in bonding. And if you look at it, on the far right, Dent Supply had a very high, the highest number, 55 megapascals, is huge. But they also had a 0. So what that meant is the sample didn't make it to the instron before it fell off. Okay? The interesting thing to note about all adhesives is this huge range. And when you look at this, in 150 samples, the range is quite large. So what it tells us as clinicians, when you take a large sample size and develop this range, is that you don't get the average. In fact, you don't know what you got when you bond something. It's a bit of Russian roulette. We hope we got the average. Sometimes we will. Sometimes we'll outperform that. And sometimes we may get a low number based on something that happened clinically. Well, with that said, you'd hope that the low end is at least high enough that you don't get failure. But the reality is each and every one of these bonding agents will have some failures of the adhesive joint. The question is, when does it occur? Well, if you look at this, say on the 0.05 megapascals of bond strength, the machine barely turned on, barely got any force on that sample before it fell off. If you had sent that out your door as a veneer, the patient would call you and say, guess what? My veneer came off the first time I chewed on it. That's not very impressive, right? If you're up at 55 megapascals, chances are that restoration is going to be there a long time. We're chasing the perfect bonding agent. We don't have it yet, but we're chasing it. What we want is something with a relatively high low end, right? That's what you really want. Who cares the highest number? So you get 70 on occasion. It's that low end that concerns us. So for me, when I look at this, I start saying, Optibond XTR in 150 students who can, if they will, screw up, something will, had a tough time screwing up with XTR, a self-etcher. They really did. 7.6 is the worst they could do. That's pretty good, even though it's a failure. It's important to recognize that. So when you talk to a company and say, hey, what's your average bond strength? Great. Tell me your range. What was your sample range? That's important. When Gordon does his data, he reports that as well. So XTR is starting to look very promising. It's got Gordon's endorsement because he did the same test. The nice thing with XTR now is you can use it as a direct or indirect bonding agent. It's the first 6th generation with very high bond strength that is indicated for both indirect and direct restorative techniques. So we can come in and use this on inlays, onlays, crowns, as well as direct resins, and quite successfully. So there are plenty of indications where I want you to start to think about a self-etcher. And really, when you start to think about a self-etcher, is where you have a lot of dentin, where the ratio of what you're trying to bond to is dentin. So here's a restoration that my father placed 15 years ago. 3 right next to each other. Lasted, no recurrent decay. The highest stress one popped out first, the cuspid. They're all placed around the same era, and it failed. And it failed adhesively. The restoration literally popped out. No recurrent decay, just an adhesive failure. And at the time, he would have been using a 2nd generation bonding agent, which had relatively low results. Didn't put in a lot of retention features, and when you look at that cuspid, the bond you establish is going to be 95% held by dentin, not the enamel. The enamel is a small piece of this restoration. That tooth is going to be held by a dentin bond. So these are indications that when we go back in and restore these, we'd want to consider, or at least consider the use of a self-etcher. Why? Because the dentin bond strengths on average are higher. So this is where, when I'm restoring this, I run to my brother's room and steal his stuff. Say, I got a perfect indication for a self-etcher. I want to bond to dentin. So root caries. Over here, I know that root caries is likely restored with glass ionomer, but let's just say you're going to live dangerously and put in composite. If you want to live dangerously with composite, then you'd use a self-etcher on root caries so that you get the highest adhesion to dentin. And you can get reasonable results with these self-etchers and composites. And I'm confident that that restoration will be there indefinitely. In California, it's not uncommon to replace existing amalgams that are serviceable with white things. Why? Because it's better to look good than to feel good in California. So we've got to have everything white, and we routinely come in. And this is another indication where we may consider the use of a self-etching adhesive. Why? Because this restoration will be largely bonded to dentin. So this is restored with premise and a self-etching component. Very easily done. Well, you also have the option of a 7th generation. And what this does is simplify your life a little more. The problem is your bond strengths crash. So with the 7th generation adhesives, yes, your life will be easy, but I guarantee you, you will see more adhesive failures in your practice. You'll have to replace more restorations. So my recommendation at this point, based on the literature, based on what we've tested, is you stay away from these. And if you think about adhesion, it's quite simply this. If you live in the 4th generation, it's cool. Keep doing what you're doing, you're fine. Why? Because you get very high bond strengths. It's 3 steps. That's fine. You want to do that? Great. If you live in the 5th generation, the only thing you need to remember is moist dentin. If you keep the dentin moist and don't desiccate, you will have almost as high bond strengths as your 4th generation colleagues. Simply said. You'll be right up there with them if you're using the right products. If you move to 6th generation, you're going to have slightly lower bond